this computer. So we should be recording, yeah. So test drive using Cypress. I'm not going to write a component test for this, but I will share an example of it. I'll explain why after the fact. But what my component is going to do is going to render my name, like a picture, and my username on the page. And we're going to use the GitHub API for this. So you can get more information from the GitHub API here. In order to get all of the information, you'll need to generate a personal access token. You can see the GitHub docs how to do this, but for the purpose of this exercise, you actually don't. You can get most data without authentication. There's a little bit more data that comes back from the API, at least from the user's endpoint, that I want you to use. And there's enough here to get all the information out. I'll be looking at things like the name, the URL if you have one. What else? We'll probably get, what was the username? Where's the username? Here. So that's what we're going to have a look at doing. That makes sense? Cool, couple of thumbs up. So some of you have already done this, so it might be a little bit familiar from yesterday, from work or even during the week. But this is also going to be useful to make sure you have a process for this for the new summary app. How to make a request to an API. So let's have a look at where we are at. Where are we? I think it's this one. Yes. Okay, so let's have a look at from the top what we need to do. So this is what I've been working on so far with all the different components that we've been playing around with this week. And so I'm just going to write another component and inject it into my app. Again, how React works, we have a main top-level app component, and we inject this into our document. The same way that we were doing last week in using doc and get env by ID, then updating the HTML. So the top-level app component is where we need to place any other components. So we're going to place things here. So I've already scaffolded a portfolio component and placed it in a GitHub directory. And you can place wherever you want. I've just named space to GitHub. And my current portfolio is empty. So this is what where I need to do some work. And I'm also going to write a spec for it here. And so we'll see the Cypress test fail, and then we'll write our component. All right. Does that, high level, does that make sense what I'm going to do? Any questions from a sort of high level about my objective? Write my feature test first, and then write my portfolio app component. Cool. So in order to write my feature test, I need to get an example a JSON, an example response from our API, and put it into this file. So I can stub the response. So let's have a look at how I can make a request. So I'm going to go back to the example here, and I'm going to have a look at how I use it. So feel free to go ahead and do the whole authentication process to get your token, and then you use the full request. You don't need to, so I'll just make a simple request to the API using my GitHub username. But you get more information if you do that. So let's send a request to dear my username. Actually, that's not. Well, let's use someone else's username. Marie, what's your username for GitHub? Oh, you're frozen.
NDO. Can you hear me?
Yep, NDOW. You are cutting in and out of it.
Oh, and then
do you want to just type it in the Discord chat? In the Discord,
KUN.
maybe type it out in the Discord because you're cutting in and out. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Okay, some thumbs up. Thank you. Boom. Thank you, Marie. Well, that's Anthony. Boom. Okay. So let's send a request and get Marie's details. So this is the response back from the GitHub API with Marie's login, GitHub ID, information about where to go get more stuff. Email. There's some things here that haven't been filled out. So I don't actually see your name here, probably because you haven't added your name to your GitHub profile. So let's find someone else. Who has added their name? Because otherwise we're just going to see null appear or nothing appear on the page. So this is a good opportunity for everyone to make sure that you've added your name details to your GitHub profile. Paulina, you raised your finger. Do you have your name there? So what's your username?
It's just my name and then KOZ.
KOZ, yeah?
Yeah.
Name Paulina. Cool. All right. Let's use that. Nice job. So I'm going to grab all of this information and I'm going to put it here. So this is like my example response. Let's now write my feature test. So let's describe, I've been calling this a portfolio just because I'm trying to get data from it can be anything that you want, and whatever component that you want to name it. Let's write a test. I want to be able to make sure that I intercept all requests made to this. This URL, and I'm putting wildcard, so it's just any request to that user's endpoint, and then I'm going to give it a stubs response using the response I've saved in that file, and I've given it a very lengthy name: unauthenticated GitHub user data JSON. I think. Yeah. Okay, so that sets up my stub, and then I'm going to write my test that says it shows the name, the GitHub user name. Just keep it simple. So what do I want my app to do? I'm going to go visit the page. And make a simple assertion that it contains Paulina. Is it lowercase or uppercase? Paulina, like that. Cool. Let's add some data here to make sure we know it's coming from our stub response, mocked data. So let's make an assertion that applies. So I want to make sure I don't actually send the request to the GitHub API. I've now stubbed it, so I want to rely on my stubbed response. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. Some nods, some thumbs. Okay, so far we've done this before, and now we have to make sure we do this in our component. So I'm going to watch this fail. I want to make sure, I think I'm already running Cypress still. Is it one of these? No, that's your calendar. And this one. Okay, let's double check. All right, so I haven't exported my component because I haven't written it yet. Makes sense. So let's go ahead and do that. So in my app, I'm importing portfolio, and here I don't have anything. So let's import React and component, because it needs to have some state. We need to manage that user data from React. And then we have to write our class. I'm calling it portfolio. So I need to do that. Extends component, and I need to write my constructor function and set it up. So let's initialize our props object, and then we're going to start off with an object that has no user data for the moment. Let's say it's going to just be empty. So this is what I'm going to update at some point when I make my request. I'm going to update the user data key with the information from the API. So I need a render function. Let's keep it super simple. And I'm going to return one element, and inside of this, I'm going to, for the moment, keep it with this dot state, and then I want user data, and then I want name. So far, so good. Some thumbs up. Does it make sense what I'm doing at the moment? Clearly, it's going to be nothing to begin with, but hopefully at some point when I make my request, user data will be populated with the data from that API, and then I extract the name property, and that should give me Paulina. When I run my test, it should give me Paulina mock data, because that's what's in this file. So I should have a difference between when I run it locally, when I run my tests. When I run it locally, it should actually make the request. And when I run my test, it should give me back mock data. But I need to actually make the request. So let's add in a lifecycle method, component mount. So this will run as soon as the render function has finished running. As you know, the constructor function runs once when you create the class, and render happens at the end of any update, and component mount happens once we've changed anything, or at least component mount happens after you've rendered. So let's execute our request. I'm going to use the fetch API. Fetch is the part of the web API, so you can access it without installing any packages. And let me get the URL. And we're doing Paulina KZ. Is that correct? Yeah, thumbs up. Cool. I want to make the request, and then get whatever data comes back, and make sure we pass it. This takes the format from JSON into JavaScript, and so we can unravel it. It returns a promise, so then I need to call past whatever, give it a name, and then call this dot set state with the new information. So I want to update my I want to update my state with whatever data comes back from my API. And I have to pass it first, because it comes back in JSON, and in order to unravel it, I need to convert it into JavaScript. All languages will have something like that when you pass JSON so it's sort of accessible and available in that language, which is why JSON is quite common as a way to format data, because you can use any programming language to sort of parse it. Okay, so let's make sure I export it. Export default portfolio. Where is my test? So you can see on my page, I've mocked it successfully. So it makes the request, gets stubbed by Cypress, and then I display the mock data on my page. If I run it locally, is it running locally? I don't know. Yeah, it is. So it's currently still being controlled by Cypress. So let's make sure I don't want to, hold on. Can I use a different port? Can I just use -p? No, it's still running my check localhost 3000. Cool. All right. So that's the request being made without the stubbed response. It just makes the request. And in my Cypress test, we refresh it. You can see that I've stubbed it, and this is what it should look like. In your Cypress test, it's stubbed, and we make the stub up here. We get the response, we store it, and then we intercept the request and we pass it our response. And we write a test that asserts on that data that comes that's stored in our fixture. Whereas in our component, when we run it locally, there's no stubbing, so we just make the request, update our state using setState, and then display it down here on line 20. Okay, so the new thing that I did was adding this method here. Let's have a look at when these things run. So if I do something like console.log, I guess constructor, and then here I'm in the component, did mount, and here I'm in the render. Let's look at our logs. So you can see two things. One, we run the constructor, then it renders, which then triggers the component mount, which causes a render because we have a this.setState, which causes the render. So that's the order in which these the lifecycle methods are firing, which makes sense. We've got to set it up. We create a class, which then renders. When it renders, it triggers the lifecycle event to happen, the component mount, and inside that function, we've written a setState, which causes another render to happen. Constructor, when we create the class, which causes the render to happen. When the render is finished, it causes the component mount, and because we have setState, it causes the render again. Now, the interesting thing here is that it actually happens twice, the constructor and the render, and that's something that React is doing mostly to verify any discrepancies. So mostly ignore the fact that it runs twice. You can read up about why React does this, but the most important thing here is the order. The constructor fires, then the render fires, then component mount, then back to render, because we're using setState, which causes the render to happen. Thoughts and questions at the moment?
Yeah, line 15.
Yep.
Do you have to specify this as JSON? So if I was doing the web API that we were with last week, where you should come back as a JSON anyway, do I still have to write line 15?
It really depends on the format of, well, two things. It depends on what the method returns. So the fetch method always returns a promise, which is why I have to use .then. And then I take that data and then I ask it to be parsed. So you call the JSON function on it. So the data is actually an object that supports the JSON function. All right, and then that causes me to return another promise, which I then can unravel. And I use the data like this. So there are a couple of things here. When we use fetch, fetch will always return a promise, so we have to do something like this. But it also depends on what the API returns. If the API just returns data that you can access immediately, then you don't need this line. Usually this is important because we should be making sure APIs return JSON in a standard fashion. So any application in different programming languages can parse it. If you return it straight in JavaScript, it's a little bit more difficult for different programming languages to manipulate. So everything should be in JSON where you should have to parse to convert it. It's usually quite straightforward in the way that this is written. And we're keeping it in the coded mount for the moment. Usually this wouldn't happen here. Usually I would write an object that handles making requests. My component wouldn't also have to make a request, but we're keeping it here for the moment for simplicity. And this is a mix of responsibilities. My fetch should not happen in my component like this. But I want you not to worry about that and just keep it here for the moment. Good question. Any other thoughts or questions when you look at this? Because this is something that I want you to do in pairs yourselves for the next 45 minutes. I want you to extract more data than just the name. Yep. Sorry.
I was just thinking, if you wanted to fetch more than one API, would you have to call more than one component mounts, or would you call them all in the same component mount file?
Yeah, this is a great question. Really great question. This is just the lifecycle event. So if you want to trigger anything at that phase, everything will have to go in this method body. So you would add in more fetch requests. So you just add, because remember, this doesn't actually return anything. This is simply saying when the component has finished mounting, then execute some stuff. And here I make the request and then using set state to trigger the render function.
Oh, yeah.
And so I could just do another request to different, like try and get someone else's data back, and then maybe create a second place to get that data. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Ideally, again, well, that's fine to hear for a moment. Good question, really good question. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
So if you had like a separate object or component to do the fetching, would you still have to put it inside the componented map?
Yeah, so it would probably look something like this, where you import I don't know, let's say a client. Clients make requests. It's a general word that we use for things that makes request from somewhere. Usually in React, anything that's not really a component lives in a utils folder that does work. Like it's called a utility, so that's what it's short for, utilities. And this might be in a parent directory somewhere. So say for example, I had something like that, and then you could inject it into your component if you want to be able to test it better. So you could have a injected dependency and then store as we usually do as a property. Maybe let's just call it that. Okay, so then I would do something like, I don't know, use my client to do all of this stuff. And we just do, maybe I just send it the URL, this or client get here. Expect that to return some useful information and execute it. So the actual fetch happens in the client. I don't have to worry about it in this component. And I could therefore easily stub it and make sure my component's just about taking data and rendering, which is what it should do.
How do you component test for this particular one? Do you have to make another stub or something like that?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And so let's talk about that afterwards, all right? I'll show you an example of a mocked component test, but for the purpose of this exercise right now, just use the Cypress speech test to remember how to stub at that level at the speech test, and then use your component mount and execute this request, making sure you can see it on the screen. All right, and we'll go through that afterwards. Any other questions at the moment?
Are you using fetch because you're not using jQuery?
Yeah, I've decided to use fetch so I don't have to install or anything else. It comes as part of the browser web API. And so in the same way I have access to the document as part of the browser API, I have access to fetch. Fetch wraps sending requests, the XML HTTP request object. So I can send requests in a fairly straightforward pattern using URL, which returns a promise, and then I unravel it using JSON, and then I unravel it to get at my data.
Yes.
Remember that fetch is asynchronous. It makes an asynchronous request, so it returns a promise. All right, not the data itself. It returns a promise that says, I'm going to wait for that data, which is why I need to use .then to say, wait for it to be resolved, and then when it's resolved, get that data and do something with it. In the same way that this JSON function returns a promise, which is why I then have to chain them again, which is why stubbing this is a little bit more complicated. I'll talk about that afterwards. Cool. Okay. The last minute questions before you all break up into pairs. So the steps I want you to take, again, make an example request to the GitHub API, get that data, store it in a fixtures file, write your feature test, stub the request, make sure you know that you're mocking the data by editing that name or whatever data you want to see, and then write your component to make your request. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.